Most people think of medieval castles as monuments to brute strength. Thick walls, high towers, boiling oil poured from battlements. The popular image is one of dramatic assaults and heroic last stands. But the truth is less theatrical and far more instructive. Castles were not primarily designed to withstand endless waves of attackers. They were built to control space, to manage time, and to shape the psychology and logistics of anyone who approached them. In fact, the most effective castles rarely needed to fight at all. Their real power lay in deterrence. A well-placed stronghold could make invasion economically irrational. It could stretch supply lines to the breaking point. It could force an enemy to choose between starvation and retreat. And when a siege did occur, the contest was less about walls collapsing and more about endurance, engineering, and the cold arithmetic of resources. Understanding how castles defended against invaders means looking past cinematic warfare and examining the layered systems, architectural, logistical, and psychological, that made them formidable instruments of survival and control. Castles were built first to dominate terrain rather than merely resist attack. The first and most important defensive feature of any castle was its location. Medieval builders were strategic thinkers. They understood that height, visibility, and access to natural barriers could multiply defensive strength before a single stone was laid. Many castles were positioned on hilltops, rocky outcrops, or river bends. This was not aesthetic preference. Elevation forced attackers to move uphill under observation, expending energy while exposed to missiles. Rivers and marshes restricted approach routes, funneling troops into predictable paths where defenders could concentrate force. Control of roads and bridges was equally critical. A castle overlooking a trade route or mountain pass did more than guard against armies. It regulated commerce and taxation. In times of war, it forced invaders to either besiege the stronghold or risk leaving a hostile garrison at their rear. An unacceptable vulnerability in medieval campaigning. From a survivalist perspective, the lesson is straightforward. Geography is force multiplication. Medieval commanders understood that preparation begins long before conflict. Terrain shapes outcomes more reliably than courage. Stone walls were only one layer in a system designed to absorb and exhaust aggression. When we look at castle walls, we often focus on thickness, yet thickness alone did not guarantee survival. What mattered was how defensive layers worked together. The curtain wall, the outer defensive wall, was usually reinforced with towers at intervals. These towers allowed flanking fire along the wall's base, eliminating blind spots where attackers might gather. The geometry was deliberate. Angles and projections ensured that any force approaching the walls would be exposed from multiple directions. Beyond the main wall, many castles incorporated a ditch or moat. Contrary to popular belief, moats were not always filled with water. A dry ditch could be just as effective, creating a steep obstacle that slowed siege equipment and exposed attackers to missiles from above. Gatehouses represented the most sophisticated defensive points. Rather than a simple doorway, they functioned as controlled kill zones. Attackers who breached the outer doors could find themselves trapped between portcullises, under fire from murder holes and arrow slits. Defense here was not about spectacle. It was about forcing the enemy into narrow, controlled spaces where numbers mattered less. Each layer bought time. Time to prepare, time for relief forces, time for the enemy to reconsider. The real battle during a siege was fought through logistics and endurance. Hollywood emphasizes storming ladders and flaming projectiles. Historically, most sieges were battles of patience. An attacking army had to feed itself. Medieval forces could not carry months of provisions. They relied on foraging or supply trains vulnerable to disruption. If the countryside had been stripped of resources, something defenders often did in advance, an invading force faced hunger quickly. Inside the castle, preparation was equally critical. Wells or cisterns ensured access to water. Granaries stored grain that could last months if rationed carefully. Livestock might be kept within outer baileys before a siege tightened. Disease was often the decisive factor. Overcrowding and poor sanitation inside a besieged castle could, really weaken defenders. Meanwhile, attackers encamped out in the open faced exposure and illness themselves. The side that managed to maintain discipline in hygiene and rationing often, prevailed. This dynamic actually reshaped medieval military doctrine. Commanders learned that honestly, taking a strong castle by direct assault was rarely efficient. Siegecraft evolved, mining under walls, constructing trebuchets, building counter-fortifications. But these methods were costly and time-consuming. The survival lesson here is austere, but clear resilience is logistical. Stockpiles, water access, and discipline determine endurance more reliably than weapons alone. Psychological warfare often mattered more than, physical destruction. A castle's imposing silhouette was itself a weapon. Massive walls signaled stability and authority. They suggested, permanence in a world defined by instability. Defenders used symbolism deliberately. Banners remained visible even during hardship to project confidence. Public displays of normalcy, like smoke from kitchens or routine patrols on the walls, communicated that morale was, in fact, intact. Attackers employed psychological tactics as well. Demonstrations of siege engines, public executions of captured soldiers, or feigned preparations for a long encampment were all meant to erode resolve. Negotiation was honestly pretty common. Terms might allow defenders to leave peacefully if surrender occurred before a breach. Refusal could mean, harsher consequences. The calculation was always pragmatic. Many sieges ended not with walls collapsing, but with negotiated surrender once food ran low or relief became unlikely. Castles were defensive tools embedded in political systems, not isolated arenas of heroic defiance. Understanding this nuance reframes medieval warfare as strategic bargaining under pressure rather than, constant spectacle. Adaptation to new weapons forced castles to evolve or, become obsolete. The introduction of gunpowder artillery in the late medieval period exposed a fundamental weakness in those traditional high walls. Cannon could just shatter vertical stone surfaces that had resisted centuries of assault. In response, fortification design changed dramatically. Walls became lower and thicker. Angled bastions were introduced to deflect cannon fire, and earthworks absorbed impact better than stone alone. This transformation, influenced early modern military architecture across Europe. The so-called Tres Italienne, with its star-shaped forts, was a direct descendant of lessons learned from castles that failed under artillery bombardment. The broader lesson here is that defensive systems must evolve alongside offensive capabilities. Static strength, honestly, becomes vulnerability when technology shifts. Medieval builders who clung to height as their primary defense saw their strongholds crumble under cannon fire. Preparedness requires adaptation, not nostalgia. Castles, in fact, shaped political authority as much as military outcomes. A castle was not simply a fortress, it was an administrative centre. From its halls, lords dispensed justice, collected taxes, and coordinated regional defence. This dual function reinforced loyalty. In times of invasion, surrounding populations might retreat within castle walls. The structure became a community refuge, not merely a military installation. Yet this concentration of authority also made castles strategic targets. Capturing a key stronghold could destabilize an entire region without a pitched battle. During conflicts such as the Norman conquest of England, castles were used systematically to secure newly taken territory. Their presence enforced political change through constant visibility. The consequence was long-term geopolitical transformation. Control of fortified networks allowed rulers to consolidate power efficiently. Castles were instruments of state formation. For viewers interested in survival and governance, the implication is significant. Infrastructure determines stability. Durable control requires secure nodes of authority. Failures reveal as much as successes about defensive reality. Not all castles held. Some fell quickly due to betrayal, inadequate supplies, or flawed design. Mining operations, digging tunnels beneath walls to collapse them, proved devastating when defenders failed to detect them in time. Other strongholds surrendered because their strategic purpose had evaporated. If surrounding territory was already lost, relief was impossible. These failures informed future construction. Thicker foundations countered mining. Improved communication systems, including beacon networks, enabled faster coordination. The medieval world was not static. It was a continuous process of testing, failure, and refinement. Castles defended against invaders not through spectacle, but through systems, geographic positioning, architectural layering, logistical preparation, psychological management, and political integration. They remind us that survival is rarely about dramatic confrontation. It is about shaping conditions so thoroughly that confrontation becomes unnecessary or unwinnable for the opponent. For serious students of history, the study of medieval castles offers more than architectural curiosity. It provides insight into how societies manage risk, project authority, and endure sustained pressure. It shows that resilience is engineered, not improvised. Understanding these lessons matters because the fundamentals of defense, terrain, supply, morale, adaptation, have never disappeared. They have only changed form. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts and share this video with others who appreciate serious history. These stories endure because the principles behind them still shape our world.